Perfect. Okay, thank you, everyone. I think we're going to get started now. So I have wonderful. Okay, well, thank you all for coming. And if you haven't already, please grab some lunch while we do this book discussion. So on behalf of the National Security Institute, welcome. And so NSI, as many of you have known, because some of your students are housed at the Antonin Scalia School of Law. And we are dedicated to finding real-world answers to national security, law, and policy questions. And there's really no better person to have here actually today than Bethany Allen, who is the Axios China reporter, who recently wrote a book that we're discussing today, The Beijing Rules, How China Weaponizes Its Economy to Confront the World. The moderator today is none other but NSI's Deputy Executive Director and co-host of NSI's flagship podcast, Fault Lines, which I recommend you all download right now after this and listen to it 3 times a week, and it gets you smart fast on the national security challenges facing the world on that given day. So it could be anything, 3 different topics. So we're thrilled to kick off a discussion about this book. The way it's going to go is we're going to have a discussion and then leave about 15 to 20 minutes, probably 20 minutes for questions. So please, as Bethany and Jess are having a conversation about the book, think of some questions that we want to answer. And Bethany's been very kind to offer her time to answer some of those questions. So without further ado, I'm going to kick it off to Jess to introduce our special guest. So thank you.
Thank you, Gabriel. I felt like it was like Jameel Fault Lines plug. So thank you for bringing up the podcast. So thank you, Bethany, for attending and speaking with us today. As Gabriel mentioned, she is the China reporter at Axios, which if you haven't checked out their website is like the greatest news source ever to get smart on topics quickly. She focuses on China issues and how it projects power beyond its borders. Before joining Axios, she was the lead reporter for the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists China Cables Project, which report on a leak of classified Chinese government documents revealing the inner workings of the mass internment camps in Xinjiang. From her work on the project, she received the Robert D.G. Lewis Watchdog Award, the top prize awarded annually by the Society of Professional Journalists, the DC Dateline Awards, and the Cables Project was a finalist for the Batten Medal for Courage in Journalism. She previously lived in China for 4 years, and she's now based in Taiwan, though because of this book, she's kind of traveling all over, so a little global citizen right now. So for those of you that haven't picked up the book, you should, because it's, one, awesome, and it does a great job of describing how China uses its economic power, which you guys know, its massive market, its source of capital, to change and control the behavior of corporations and individuals abroad, meaning most importantly for us, U.S. companies and U.S. individuals, for its own geopolitical objectives. So my first question is, you're based in Taiwan, you're writing on China, you just wrote a book exposing a lot of stories that paint China in unfriendly ways. What is the reaction you've gotten, whether it's from readers or policymakers here, or from those in the CCP?
Well, thank you so much for having me today and for this invitation. I was just telling Jessica how much I love coming and talking to students, especially upper-level students, because students are so curious and ask questions because they want to know the answers, not because they're trying to make a point. So it's just wonderful to be with you here today. So there's been there's been tons of interest in the book, and for those of you if you've ever written a book or plan to write a book, I think a common fear is that when you publish a book, it'll be like, a tree falling in a forest. What if there's no one around to hear it? Does it actually make a sound? So I was afraid that I would just publish this book and nothing would happen. Like, no one would read it, no one would tweet about it, no one would hate it, no one would love it. But that is not what has happened. There's been a ton of interest, especially interest from government officials in countries around the world, particularly like-minded partners and allies of the U.S., whether it's people in ministries of foreign affairs, State Departments, the State Department, embassies in D.C., intelligence officials, the Pentagon, lots of interest from governments, and of course that's what one of the things I was hoping for. I have a whole chapter at the end about policy recommendations, both internationally and domestically. And I've also gotten a lot of interest from human rights organizations such as the National Endowment for Democracy and other organizations that promote human rights. And that's the other really big goal of my book. I lived and reported from DC for 8 years. And the longer that I have been a journalist, the more surprised and kind of shocked I have been at how many discussions you can go to in DC and how many meetings and roundtables you can have that talk about strategy and national security and never talk about democracy. And that has increasingly disturbed me because any country in the world can have national security. China can have national security. Iran, North Korea, they can have national security. That's not special. National security is for something. It's to preserve our democratic way of life and to show the rest of the world how beneficial it is to everyone in society to have human rights and to have political rights. So the true point of my book, isn't how can the U.S. counter China, but how can democracy prevail over authoritarianism, and specifically through a means using through means of economic power.
And to that point, you trace the idea throughout the book how the U.S. and other Western leaders really, we equate open markets of political freedom and democracy. And so, as we all know, we all thought China would liberalize as, they joined the WTO and they joined the global economy. And we know that now to not be true. And it's frankly quite the opposite, which is the thesis of your book. And, you make the argument that the U.S. really laid the groundwork to allow China to develop and exploit its, you call it authoritarian style of state capitalism. So if you could just kind of walk us through that.
Sure. I mean, in the 90s, there was this sense of triumphalism. We're all familiar with this now. And in retrospect, of course, it looks naive. This idea that market capitalism and open and free markets would inherently are the same thing. Not even just that they would lead to democracy, but that they are democracy. They are freedom. And if you look at some, in my book, I mentioned the Cato Institute has
I loved that point. That was one of my favorites.
The Cato Institute has this annual freedom index where they rate freedoms around the world, and they incorporate not just political civil rights, civil freedoms, but also like economic freedom and stuff, and level of taxes. And they rated Hong Kong as like the 6th most free place in the world in I think it was 2019 or 2020. And it was just so remarkable that that they could
low corporate tax.
It has low corp. You'll go to jail for thinking bad things about Beijing, but by God, you don't have to pay high taxes if you're rich. Freedom. So this idea that these are not just linked, but they're in fact the same thing. And this is a core tenet of neoliberalism, or whatever word you want to use to describe the rise of a very lightly regulated, economic framework that we've seen in the past 40 years. This is a very convenient ideology because it allows companies to say, well, in that case, we can go and have as much economic activity as we want with in any country, with any regime. It doesn't matter how bad it is, because our wonderful corporate behavior will inevitably result in the democratization of that country. And that's a very convenient narrative. And so because of that, and because of the rise of neoliberalism, democratic political guardrails were delinked from economic behavior, creating a kind of political, moral, and regulatory void on the international stage and inside of various countries domestically, including the U.S. But the thing is that capital, or money, like any form of power, is inherently morally neutral. It reflects the values of the people who wield it. So when Milton Friedman was coming up with all his ideas in the 1970s, and Reagan adopted them in the 1980s, Friedman wasn't thinking, what will happen if these markets, if all this capital is controlled by an authoritarian government? Because in the 1970s, there was an economic blockade. There was a clear divide between the Soviet Union and democratic capitalist nations. There wasn't this Soviet pressure to change their behavior in order to make money in the Soviet Union. My main point in laying this out is, even though I'm not a fan of being motivated by greed, however, I think that it is on some level, how do I want to put this? Naming and shaming companies for kowtowing to Beijing, or for self-censoring on behalf of Beijing, or basically changing their behavior to do what the Chinese Communist Party wants. Naming and shaming them is okay to do, but it is not enough. It will not change their behavior. And fundamentally, it's a reflection of the fact that we have put CEOs on a moral pedestal, that we expect them unlike everyone else in society, to give up millions and millions of dollars in order to tweet things. And we don't expect that of other people. So what I argue in my book is that what the U.S. needs to do and other democracies need to do is to relink democratic values and behavior with international and domestic economic activity. And that is really the only way to push back against the Chinese Communist Party's authoritarian economic statecraft.
So we're going to get to your recommendations because she truly has a to-do list for countries, some of which seems very hard. But so you mentioned, you basically are pitting, our system is pitting U.S. companies and individuals basically against the CCP, right? We created a system where it's profits and shareholders, number one, but then we're asking them to make moral decisions that support our political interests. And so you have a few examples. And so you brought up Zoom, which we laughed, we did a prep call, and we're both on Zoom talking about the bad actions of Zoom, and we're still using it, and so does the federal government, so does everybody. As consumers, we've decided that's okay. And so if you guys don't know, Zoom is an American company. It does have an R&D operation base in China, so it has a large presence there. And so I had heard about kind of the Zoom kerfuffle during COVID, but I didn't really track it. So maybe if you could tell us a little bit about it and how finally our government actually stepped up, after a lot of pressure and a lot of controversy.
Sure. So in 2019, Zoom was blocked from the Chinese market. Now, I want to distinguish this from, so Zoom has an R&D team, or at least in 2019, around 700 employees based in China. And in their disclosures to the U.S. government, their financial disclosures, they had disclosed this and then said, we understand that this is a political and essentially reputational risk to Zoom to have these employees there, but we're going to do it anyway because it's good for our bottom line, because it saves us money, and this is how this contributes to our revenues or to our profit making ability. And so they're like, it's probably risky, but we're going to do it anyway. And so in 2019, they were blocked from the Chinese market, which means their platform was no longer available to Chinese users. And so the Chinese government came to them and said, look, in order for you to be unblocked in the market, you need to come up with a rectification plan. This was not public at the time. We knew that Zoom had been blocked. We knew they got unblocked a couple of months later. None of this at the time was public knowledge, what happened in between. So the Chinese government actually the Ministry of State Security in Hangzhou came to them and said, you need to come up with a rectification plan where you're going to show us how you're going to more proactively implement ongoing real-time surveillance and censorship of what's happening on the Chinese platform of Chinese users, and also that you will hand over data and the identities of anyone in China using the platform, and that's how you'll get unblocked. And so Zoom was like, okay, and so they did. And part of this rectification plan was that they appoint a Zoom employee to be the liaison, the official liaison, with the Ministry of State Security and the Ministry of Public Security, so that he could, take their directives and give them to Zoom. Now, to be clear, this rectification plan technically only applied to the Chinese market. That doesn't make it okay. It's still not okay to censor in the Chinese market, but the Chinese government was not directing, at least not from the top down, not telling Zoom executives that they needed to censor outside of China. But what happened was, when we all started using Zoom in the pandemic, and Zoom's the daily user base went from 10 million to 300 million within a couple of months. Great windfall for Zoom. Also a great windfall for China's Ministry of State Security. And so what happened was this Zoom employee who was in China, his name was Xin Zhangjin, or Julian Jean is his English name. He started getting requests from the Ministry of State Security that went beyond his initial remit. But in 2017, the Chinese government implemented the National Intelligence Law. And Article 7 of the National Intelligence Law says that any person or individual or company in China has to, upon request by China's intelligence services, hand over any data or provide any assistance that the intelligence services require, and to keep that assistance a secret, Article 7. So presumably acting under this article, this employee felt that he had to do what the Ministry of State Security asked, and that he had to keep it a secret from Zoom. And in fact, the MSS came into Zoom's offices in Hangzhou and had the employees there sign a non-disclosure agreement about some of the things that the MSS was asking. In any case, to make a long story short, he began trying to, in fact, effectively surveilling users outside of China, handing over their data to the Chinese government, and in fact was able to successfully shut down some meetings happening in the US and in Hong Kong about Tiananmen memorials in June. And these meetings were hosted by US citizens on US servers in the US by a US company, paid for by US credit cards, and they were still shut down. I reported on this in June 2020, and several lawmakers were like, oh, this is bad, and they wrote letters to Zoom, and Zoom didn't do anything. Zoom didn't do anything. The thing that forced Zoom to do something was that in June, unbeknownst to me at the time, the Department of Justice saw the reporting about it and launched an investigation into what had happened. This is really significant because this is the first time that the Department of Justice has actually carried out an investigation into, you could call it digital transnational repression, and then ending up issuing an actual indictment and arrest warrant because of it. So in December 2020, DOJ issued a very lengthy indictment, 40-plus pages, detailing everything I just told you about Xinjiang Jin. And this is the only reason we know that this is how this happened. And one of my points in the book is that the Zoom case, and there's many other similar cases, demonstrate a reason that naming and shaming is no longer enough. That's what I did. I wrote an article. Lots of other outlets picked it up. Tons of naming and shaming, and Zoom did not change its behavior because they didn't have to. They didn't have to. There was enough monetary incentive and pressure from the Chinese government side that was not enough to change their behavior. The only thing that did was when the Department of Justice came up with some actually fairly innovative charges, because it's not illegal to censor on behalf of a foreign government. It's just not. So they had to find different ways of doing it, and that is what pressured Zoom to change, although they still have employees.
Yes, I was going to say
in
still,
China.
yeah.
They still have employees in China. But this goes to a point which you had mentioned and I write in my book, is that the way things are now, and in fact it's still mostly this way, you have the world's largest single party, the world's largest political party, and certainly the world's largest authoritarian political party, the CCP, with 90 million members, which sits over the world's largest and most powerful authoritarian state, versus Zoom. Who's going to win every single time? Well, the Chinese government. And it's not because Zoom is, insufficiently moral. It's because nobody can win that fight. What I say, and what the DOJ case demonstrates, is that when you start regulating or enforcing laws on the books or passing new regulations to change the behavior of U.S. companies, that's not like a restriction on their freedom. What you're doing is raising this to the level of a government to government fight. It becomes a contest of equals. And that is the best way to push back against the way the Chinese government uses its economy.
So you mentioned that DOJ started this investigation, which you weren't aware of. I mean, do you think policymakers, other than outside of the department, were paying attention also to this example of Zoom?
Oh, absolutely. There was this censorship in June 2020 really upset a lot of lawmakers who wrote letters to Zoom, and it was bipartisan. It wasn't Marco Rubio, who's very outspoken about this. I believe was one of the people who wrote a letter to Zoom, demanding information. But also there was also a prominent Democrat who did as well separately. So it was very much a bipartisan issue. But this is not really a happy ending. It's just like not as bad of an ending.
Something happened.
Yeah. What we still don't know, and one of the measures that I call for in my final chapter, which is called Building a Democratic Economic Statecraft, is that one of the regulations that I want to see are mandatory disclosures for any U.S. company that is operating in the Chinese market and has a liaison with China's intelligence and security agencies. This should be a mandatory public disclosure. Do you have a liaison like this or multiple? What are their names? What do they do? What is every single request that they get? This is incredibly important because it is a legal, it's waging lawfare against the Chinese government's authoritarian law. Their law, rule of law or rule by law is again not morally neutral. You can bend it either way. That's an authoritarian law. There needs to be a law pushing back against that to say, oh, you say by law that employees have to keep this a secret. Well, we say by law they have to make it public. So then you have a legal system versus a legal system, and that's a fight. That's a fair fight. We can use that. We can do something with that.
I mean, I think this is what we talked about in our prep call. When we think of rule of law here in the States, you think of transparency, you think of fairness, equity, even human rights, right? Almost international law. So rule by law in the way that, the examples you show, like coercion by law, instead of kind of subtle informal policies and, rubbing elbows, the CCP is now using, to your point, legal frameworks and structures to their will.
Right, and that's been a big change over the past 10 years under Xi Jinping. And there's so in Chinese, there's a term 法治权, and you can translate that as rule of law. But you can also translate it, as the Chinese legal scholar Jeremy Cohen has, as rule by law in the case of China. And let me clarify what that means. Rule of law, I'm not going to explain rule of law to you guys. You know what that is. Rule by law, it's a little different. It's where an authoritarian government uses law to bend citizens to its will. And so citizens, in this case, the law is not designed to restrain the behavior of government. So citizens more or less cannot, or it's very difficult for them to use that law to sue the government or to shape the government behavior or restrain the government behavior. It's only for the government to extend its power over citizens and over civil society. That's rule by law. And that's what we are seeing increasingly from the Chinese government. Also, not just domestically, but also internationally in various ways, through extraterritorial jurisdiction, as we've seen in a very clear, obvious, and explicit way in the Hong Kong National Security Law. Article 37 and 38 of the Hong Kong National Security Law say very plainly, oh, by the way, all the previous articles apply to residents who are outside of Hong Kong. Let me tell you about when I first read that. So the full draft of the Hong Kong National Security Law was released at the same time it was implemented.
Like same night?
Yeah, the exact same minute. It went online
during COVID.
During
right? Very
COVID,
timely.
right. I have a chapter about this, how the Chinese government basically used the preoccupation of Western societies and democratic governments with COVID to roll out this law in Hong Kong. And they released the law and implemented it at noon, July 1st, D.C. time. That was midnight in Hong Kong, 12 hours before, but it was noon here. I was in D.C. and I was waiting for it, so I got it like at 12:01, and so I started reading it, and I got to Article 37, and I read it, and I was like, wait, what? This applies to residents outside of Hong Kong. Residents outside of Hong Kong. What does that mean? Now, it was in Chinese, and so I was like, my Chinese is good, but I'm not like a native speaker. Like, am I misunderstanding this? And so I immediately called up about 4 or 5 different scholars of Chinese law, and I was like, can you look at this? What does this mean? This law applies to residents outside of Hong Kong. And they're like, well, it means it applies to everyone outside of Hong Kong. And I was like, oh. and it's clear that Hong Kong authorities mean that it does, although they don't have a lot of mechanisms by which to try to enforce that, although they're working on it. So that's
now.
Right now, they're trying. So extraterritorial jurisdiction is one form of this extension of rule by law. But we also see it the way that the Chinese government is trying to reshape international legal norms, which are now based on Western, I hate calling it that. It's not that. It's universal. But based on human rights, based on liberal norms, trying to reshape international law, which is a very weak kind of law, if you will, to make it an authoritarian international law. And I won't get into that, but the rule by law means basically that.
The interesting extension of like top cover for other bad actors in the system to use China as, the predecessor and leading the way. So before we get into more details on like the examples of it, what I also thought was interesting is your focus on how China defines its core interests. Right, it's not not just national security. The growing list of things that fall under what its core interest, where it's willing to kind of bend the rules or use kind of attacks, maybe lose business or maybe lose a little international standing while it uses its coercive actions. So if you can tell us, like, is that growth? Is it going to continue? Like, how has that evolved?
Yeah. Let me just back up a little bit, and I don't think I actually gave my sort of short definition of what I call authoritarian economic statecraft, which is what I mean by weaponizing its economy. Economic statecraft is, of course, the use of economic power for geopolitical purposes, a concept that I think is becoming more well known, but in the past, I think our society, certainly in the way we organize a lot of our institutions, it creates this very harsh divide between economics and politics, and that's, that divide, I think, was never particularly appropriate, but it's become more and more blurry. But in any case, so China's authoritarian economic statecraft is how the Chinese Communist Party has created actually some very innovative and creative tools to use levers of power through its economy to shape the decision making of individuals, companies, governments, and multilateral institutions to bring them more in line with the CCP's core interests. What are these core interests? Well, traditionally, they were primarily 3 or 4 things. And, the 3 T's, so Tibet, Taiwan, Tiananmen. Don't challenge our territorial sovereignty in Tibet or Taiwan, and don't talk about our domestic human rights record. But we've seen these core interests expand, especially over the past 10 years, to include other elements of China's claims on various kinds of territorial sovereignty, such as the South China Sea, and now Xinjiang and the genocide in Xinjiang, Hong Kong now, very much so. But what happened in the first early months of the pandemic is that it's very clear that the Chinese Communist Party's list of core interests was expanded to include the debate or the scientific inquiry into the origins of the coronavirus pandemic. And so we saw all these levers of power that have traditionally only been used to affect the freedom of expression and freedom of activity and organization of like the Taiwanese government or Taiwanese people or Hong Kongers or Uyghurs or Tibetans was now being applied to literally everybody in the world.
Narrative.
Yes, everyone, and in a way that actually affects the well-being and health of everyone in the world. Because, as public health experts say, when you have an epidemic or a pandemic, it's absolutely key to know how it started, to understand how to treat it, and then understand how to prevent it in the future. And so, the Chinese government was actively stymieing not just open debate, although certainly open debate, but actual scientific, factual inquiry. And a very good example of this, although there are many, is how in April 2020, when then Prime Minister of Australia, Scott Morrison, called for an independent inquiry into an independent investigation into the origins of the coronavirus. And very soon after that, the Chinese government slapped a bunch of tariffs on Australian wine, coal, and barley. And oh my God, I can't stand some of the headlines from that time that were like, China and Australia having a trade spat. And I'm like, no, there's not this divide between politics and economy. This is not a trade spat. It's a political spat. This is geopolitical. And so, there were these tariffs. And that's a great example of targeting an actual government because of it doing something that is, it's not so much democratic as it is just, basic free expression,
and you
which is
give
democracy.
Example again with the vaccines and the effectiveness.
Yes.
But part of the argument when you give the examples of the narrative shaped about COVID and its origins, as well as the vaccines, and China, developed their own vaccines and shared them globally, and that was a big win. They provided them before a lot of Western nations to a lot of countries that weren't able to access vaccines, is that then it kind of blocked information about how effective it was. And so they almost shoot themselves. They start the narrative and it's going strong, and they kind of shoot themselves in the foot because it's too much messaging that turns out to be false. Is that going to be, are they going to get smart on that? Is that one of the ways that, they're kind of hurting themselves, or are they going to keep doing it?
Yeah, this is one of the things that actually surprised me about how the Chinese government reacted to this. And one of the things that I certainly grew up hearing, and then in the early years of my journalism career would hear over and over, is that, oh, well, the Chinese government is trying to censor the internet. That's definitely going to fail. That will certainly result in the imminent demise of the Chinese Communist Party. And then when they're blocking this or they're blocking that, that is definitely going to fail, and it's definitely going to result in the imminent demise of the Chinese Communist Party. And it never did, And so I definitely want to, in my book and generally in my work, I back away from the idea. I never take as an assumption that authoritarian behavior is going to inevitably fail. Because, the Chinese government has shown that it in fact can be very successful according to authoritarian goals. However, it's also too extreme to say the Chinese government is always going to succeed in what it wants. So I'll get into the specifics of that. So in the early months of the pandemic, this suppression of free scientific knowledge and inquiry was applied to the origins of the pandemic. But then later, as the Chinese government and Chinese companies, did really do a heroic effort, just like we did in the U.S. and in Europe, to roll out vaccines. Now, their vaccines, they were able to produce very quickly, were from an older technology, deactivated viruses, rather than the newer technology of the mRNA vaccines that Pfizer and Moderna put out. So they were less effective, but they were still, effective, especially for the initial strains, and they were much cheaper. And so, but the Chinese government went too far with that. The Xi Jinping really hitched his reputational wagon. He really hitched, the wagon of the CCP's legitimacy to the superiority of Chinese vaccines. And so we saw both censorship and propaganda and, in fact, covert disinformation coming from China, also coming from Russia, and amplified by both, about how Western-made mRNA vaccines were dangerous, they were killing people, they weren't effective, and about the wonderful efficacy of Chinese-made vaccines. Where this really failed, and surprised me that it failed, because you could have done that and still not failed in this way, is that the Chinese government never approved the use of mRNA vaccines in China. They were like, we are only going to use Chinese-made vaccines because they are the best, and it was just really shooting themselves in the foot, because that, combined with China's zero COVID policy, meant that people were not vaccinated enough, and they were not vaccinated with a strong enough vaccine that would bring deaths down to a low enough level to make it safe to open up. And so, as we all know, it put China in this kind of like death spiral of control and restrictions and lockdowns that damaged its economy, but I think more importantly, actually damaged like the psyches and the well-being of Chinese people, and resulted in the first time in my journalism career that I've really seen mass disillusionment in China with the CCP and the way that it governs.
But then you also bring up, but then Xi is able at the end of that. There was protests, but the regime is still there. The CCP is still there. It's outlasted those controversies.
So it did not result in the imminent demise of the Chinese Communist Party. Yeah, still.
So you mentioned that China's been kind of operating subtly, using its economic coercion and its economic statecraft, but now it's doing it a little more brazenly and openly. And I think, would you say COVID is really the first instance? You talk about the gap between kind of maybe what the U.S. government is tracking internally and what the U.S. public is aware of, and then COVID with the supply chain issues and folks not able to get basic PPE. Is that really kind of the first punch in the face where a lot of the American public is starting to realize the power of the CCP?
Absolutely. So prior to 2020, people who've worked on China, people who've worked on human rights issues, have known for a long time that the Chinese government has global ambitions. But where we have seen, those of us who've watched closely, we know that because we have paid attention to relatively small communities. So, what has happened to Tibetan communities abroad, how the Chinese government has long targeted Taiwanese communities abroad and pro-democracy communities abroad, when lots of people, there was a mass exodus, basically, of young liberal people in China after Tiananmen in the 90s, and how, they have been followed and harassed and surveilled and co-opted. But it was very easy for most people to say, that is super unfortunate for the Tibetans, of which there are 10 million, or, that's so sad for the Taiwanese, but it's like this little island, big bummer for them, but not really an issue for the rest of us. And those of us who follow this very closely know that, on the one hand, that's extremely upsetting, because you can't treat human beings that way. But second, it demonstrates a type and a degree of power. If the Chinese government can interfere in those communities abroad, can't they interfere in other communities abroad? And so what really led me to write this book, or to turn it from a proposal into a book, was when I saw all of these levers of power, from this economic statecraft to disinformation, extraterritorial censorship, extension of China's rule by law. I saw all of this being applied in a much more brazen way, and in a way that was affecting so many people around the world. And it was kind of like the moment when all of us were kind of shocked into realizing, and I think with PPE, I talked with European lawmakers who said that it was really this moment of collective shock, where we realized that we no longer had the ability to make masks. We couldn't. We had to get them from China, and it was like they just kind of woke up to this.
And we're negotiating against each other with China.
Yeah.
So I know we don't do black and white. There's no end of scenarios. But now that the China's core interests are this expanding group, and now people are realizing they may fall under the impacted populations or groupings. Do you think China is going to maybe start to mitigate, actually keep the core interest as it is for now and see, not push the envelope too far, too fast? Or you think now that they've gotten the go-ahead, as you put it, say some U.S. companies actually naming and shaming works, or add some democratic guardrails, losing some business, they're willing to pay that tax?
Yeah, that's a great question. What we're seeing right now, just in the past few months, there's a number of trends. First of all, is that the Chinese economy is finally truly slowing down. People have again been saying for 15 years, oh, China's real estate sector, it's a bubble, it's unsustainable. Surely the Chinese economy will soon be facing doom. And it's the same narrative. And it never was. Because for lots of reasons, when you have an economy growing that fast, it can kind of grow its way to some extent out of debt, et cetera, et cetera. But it really is now, for real, running out of steam. And we know that it seems that Xi Jinping now actually wants to let it kind of deflate. And there are, there's all these headlines. Oh, the end of the Chinese economy. No, it's still 3/4 the size of the U.S. economy. It's still growing at a rate that's more rapid than the U.S., but it is facing severe, headwinds. What does that mean for this kind of economic power? What it means is that the Chinese market may not be as alluring as it has been in the past, but it is still very alluring. We are still seeing U.S. businesses and industry associations, urging the U.S. government, help us get back into the Chinese market. Going to China, meeting with Xi Jinping in Beijing, saying, how can we get back into the Chinese market? And I lost my train of thought.
They're still an alluring market.
Yes. Oh, right. So let me give an example from 1997 that can demonstrate what I think, give a good example of how much power the Chinese market has now. In 1997, the Chinese economy was 1/10 the size of the U.S. approximately, and its box office was basically negligible. It just didn't make money. It wasn't developed at all. What happened in 1997? That was the year that there were 2 Hollywood movies made about Tibet. One of them was 7 Years in Tibet with Brad Pitt, made by Columbia TriStar. And the other one was, famous examples. The other was Kundun by Disney and Martin Scorsese. And the Chinese government responded to those movies by essentially blacklisting Columbia TriStar for the next 7 years, and by not allowing Disney's Mulan, the original animated version, to be shown in the Chinese box office. And this was kind of an earthquake across Hollywood studios. And in the past 26 years, ever since that, there has not been one single major Hollywood production that has gone against the CCP's core interests or red lines. Not one. And in 1997, this happened. This self-censorship started not because of actual riches, but because of merely the promise of future riches. So compare that now to 2023, when the Chinese economy is, some people say that from a PPP, so a purchasing power parity perspective, that the Chinese economy has actually already surpassed the U.S., but it's most certainly a near-peer economic competitor. Is any company in the world going to be like, no, it's fine, we're good, we don't need to enter that market?
Or you could be Google, do that, and then try to walk it back.
Right.
And then
exactly with Project Dragonfly. One thing I do want to mention is that I've talked a lot about how the Chinese government is using its economy to push its political agenda around the world. I am aware that the U.S. government was not the originator, but is the superpower in terms of economic statecraft. And I address this at the very beginning of my book, where I compare and contrast U.S. and Western versus Chinese economic statecraft. And the most obvious and more traditional form of economic statecraft that we're familiar with is, of course, sanctions. And the U.S. sanctions regime is ever expanding. Some of those are multilateral, some of those are not. But there's a couple of big differences, and very clear differences, between the way the U.S. does this and the way the Chinese government does it. One of them is about the goals. So U.S. sanctions are, in the modern era, so let's say the post-Cold War era, are almost exclusively levied in order to accomplish goals that are widely agreed upon by the international community to be accepted values. So combating nuclear proliferation, combating money laundering and other activities that could damage the integrity of the international financial system, combating terrorist financing, punishing gross violators of human rights. These kinds of issues. Of course, with Russia, punishing someone who has invaded another country. Now, the U.S. invaded Iraq. That was bad. Countries can do bad things at the same time if they do good things. And also, U.S. sanctions. The global community has not always agreed that the U.S. sanctions are the way to accomplish these multilateral goals. There's been enormous criticism of the humanitarian effects of U.S. sanctions, a very strict U.S. sanctions regime, such as in Iraq, for example. But the goals are there, the desire to accomplish these goals. And there are very few exceptions to the way that the U.S. levies sanctions in pursuit of these goals. And I'll give you an exception, and in some ways the exception proves the rule. During the Trump administration, sanctioned 2 international criminal court investigators who were investigating potential U.S. war crimes in Afghanistan. That's an abuse. That was an authoritarian, illiberal abuse of U.S. sanctions. And when the Biden administration came in, they lifted those sanctions and said that was wrong. We should not have used our system in that way. The U.S. does not sanction people for tweets. The U.S. does not sanction people for calling the U.S. racist. The U.S. does not sanction all kinds of behavior. We actually have a high degree of political restraint. It doesn't mean you have to agree with the use of those sanctions, but the goals are basically liberal and multilateral. On the Chinese government side, it could not be more different. The Chinese government uses its economic statecraft exclusively, 100% exclusively, to pursue its own unilateral goals. And let me just give examples of that. So to pursue these core interests. Taiwan belonging to China, so Taiwan being annexed by China, is not an agreed upon multilateral goal. Only China wants it. And the only reason that there are countries that say they support China's sovereignty is because Beijing has pressured them to do so, not because they actually think the world would be a better place if that were the case. And the same is true for so many other, basically all of China's core interests. These are not agreed upon multilateral goals. And the other major difference is a bit of it seems like a technical one, but it's actually quite important. So U.S. sanctions and multilateral sanctions are de jure. They are transparent. We know the date that they are, that they become policy. We know why. You can go to the U.S. Treasury website and see who it's targeting, from when, why, and for what. So then there's a way to push back against it. We all know this is a real thing. This is like rule of law, transparency. The Chinese government, on the other hand, is largely de facto and largely opaque. So these things will just appear, or they'll lie about why they're happening. So with the Australia example, slapping enormous tariffs on Australian wine. That wasn't because there was anything wrong with the way that Australia was. It wasn't doing wine dumping. There weren't vast subsidies of the wine industry for geopolitical reasons. It was because of this other thing. And so, there's none of that transparency, and there's not that rule of law aspect of it, which is important on the international stage. Very important for the liberal norms that we want to uphold. Now that is changing a little bit, and it's been very interesting just in the past 2 years to see the Chinese government roll out some sort of sanctions mechanisms that are much more similar to the kinds of mechanisms that the U.S. has. So, for example, my editor laughs every time I say this: the anti-foreign sanctions law.
That's actually what it's called.
Yeah, it's actually what it's called. My editor says it sounds like the evil lightsaber of doom law or something. It sounds so authoritarian, but that's actually what it's called. And another mechanism, and actual sanctions, like actual sanctions that the Chinese government will now announce on people like some members of the European Parliament and some think tanks in the UK and Europe and in the US, because of the way that they have criticized China or the way that they have talked about, for example, the genocide in Xinjiang.
So for my last question, because I definitely want to leave it up open to you guys, and so this was actually written by Gabriel Otis. So taking all this in, and now looking just recently, Xi didn't go to UNGA. He's not in New York. He didn't go to New York. China skipped the G20. We talked about them creating kind of another set of international norms. With these developments, are you optimistic about the future? Where we're trending. We just talked about a lesser degree of economic power that they may have. Like, what do you see happening, in the near term?
There's I think still divided thoughts about why Xi Jinping has been skipping these major established summits, and some people think it's because of the domestic troubles at home. So the flagging economy. He has dismissed, or two top ministers that he chose have now been disappeared within the past 2 months. The defense minister and the foreign minister, and then also the head of the PLA rocket force. So actually 3. This is basically unprecedented in post-Mao Chinese government history, and it suggests that there could be some, that he's staying at home to deal with domestic issues, which Biden has done, Trump has done, and been criticized for doing that. So maybe it's that, or because he has now skipped several, so G20 and UNGA, and may skip APEC in November, I believe. Some people think that it's, and because he did this at the same time that he rolled out this big new treatise on China's vision for global governance.
And BRICS is expanding.
Yes, and the expansion of BRICS. He did go to BRICS and announce an expansion of BRICS, which is widely viewed as a big win for China's global political clout. There is this sense that he has actually changed tack. Previously, his strategy for currying influence abroad and strengthening China's influence was to try to dominate everything. We want to get all the influence we can in the UN and in the G20 and in all of these organizations. Meanwhile, starting our own China-centric organizations. So there's a question now, is he in fact sort of not giving up on those, but trying to make them just less important? So for example, when Biden has skipped, or when Obama or when Trump has skipped summits, when Trump didn't go to APEC when it was held in Beijing some number of years ago, I believe. And so some of the analysis was that he is diminishing the importance of this organization, because for the U.S. the U.S. is so huge and so important, merely by attending, it is elevating the status of this organization. Has Xi Jinping and has China reached such a status that by not attending, they are inherently diminishing the importance of those organizations? Has Xi Jinping come to this understanding now that that is actually the level of status he has? And if so, is he doing this on purpose to diminish the importance of these organizations and at the same time to raise the importance of his vision of an alternate system? And if so, this really changes our understanding of Beijing's approach to the world they want to see. Up to this point, people have said, this is sort of the trite analysis, is that, China wants to work from within, the CCP wants to work from within to reshape global institutions to bring them more in line with China's authoritarian values and goals, while also having its own organizations. Is it changing that to say, actually, it is totally revisionist? It wants to wash away the old system or put it into, make it irrelevant and replace it with its own system, then Western nations will have to come and beg at. Is that what he wants? I don't know.
Optimistic. I'll go with optimistic as your answer for the future. Okay, so I'm going to open it. You guys hopefully have questions.
Yeah. I really loved your comment that national security is for something. And I was thinking about, for context, I'm Canadian and I've lived in Vancouver for the past 5 years or so, where there's a huge Chinese population. Thank you, appreciate it. I'm Canadian and I've lived in Vancouver for the past 5 years, where there's a huge Chinese population, huge Chinese influence, and even in one of the suburbs, they built a Belt and Road Initiative warehouse recently. So with these issues of sort of soft power, whether that's economic soft power like the Belt and Road, or political soft power with the Chinese police stations and sort of civilians informing on other civilians back to China in countries like Canada or the United States, how do we combat that on the economic and on the social level without then starting to economically interfere with other countries or interfere with civil liberties on our homeland and sort of become the monster we're fighting ourselves?
I love that question, and I think that is something that should always be at the forefront of our discussions. And one of my earlier, I think it's chapter 3, is about that exact question. And so when it comes to overseas Chinese communities abroad, one of the things I do in several chapters in my book is lay out how they have been a primary target of Chinese Communist Party surveillance, harassment, censorship, and control and co-optation for 30 years now. And I put out a framework in my book. I describe something called a dual function strategy, which is the way the Chinese government tries to co-opt and use what would have been independent Chinese community organizations abroad and try to use them for Beijing's purposes. So I call on the Chinese government to cease that strategy, because what it does, very intentionally, I believe, is it fosters suspicion and division within the host countries towards overseas Chinese communities. And what it does is, and we've seen this so clearly in the United States, and now we're seeing it also in Canada, in Australia, and New Zealand, and the UK, all Five Eyes countries, is this maybe what China's trying to do here, is on the one hand, you get people who are very hawkish, who, in my opinion, put national security above all else, and have never experienced what it's like to be on the receiving end of that. So, for example, American Muslims know what that's like. And so they say, oh, that's a, this organization, they're communist spies, and they're communist spies, and they're Chinese communist spies, and they're all communist spies, and this is, kind of this McCarthyist kind of Red Scare kind of a thing. And one of the worst examples I've seen of this is when Marsha Blackburn, who's a senator from Tennessee, I'm on her mailing list. I won't go into that. I'm on her mailing list. And about 2 months ago, she sent out an email about how they had uncovered how Confucius classrooms, so Confucius institutes are at universities, Confucius classrooms are K through 12, and they had uncovered like 72 Confucius classrooms that were within some number of miles of sensitive U.S. military facilities. And I was like, are you actually suggesting that the Chinese people brought in to teach second graders how to say ni hao are secret communist spies trying to get our missile technology? I was just like, are you serious? Okay, so we have this phenomenon. And that's an exaggeration. Although they're seeing something real, it's too far. But then on the other side, you get people who are very concerned about preserving the rights of immigrants and preserving the rights of people of color and fighting racism and fighting xenophobia. And then they look at, Confucius classrooms and they say, are you serious? Like, counting to 10 in Chinese does not turn people into communist spies. And they'll look at calligraphy classes held on weekends by community organizations that also have ties to the Chinese consulate, but are real classes in calligraphy. And they say, look, this is not communist calligraphy. Like, this is fine. You're a bunch of racists. Everything you're saying is totally conspiratorial, and that's not real. These people are fine. And it creates this terrible division. And who are the first and the last victims of that? It's Chinese communities. So what I lay out in my chapter is to have a focus on, 1, preserving, and 2, restoring the democratic rights and civil liberties of overseas Chinese communities. Preserving, meaning not going down that path of trying to root out the secret bad people in those communities. As we saw in the U.S. after 9/11, this overreach of a domestic security state that really terrorized the lives of many American Muslims. And then on the other hand, to restore their rights. Because one of the things that is true, and a lot of my reporting a number of years ago was based on this, just because of what Chinese people in America told me, that their Chinese language community newspapers have been, for various reasons, coerced or co-opted by the Chinese Communist Party, and they cannot publish freely in their own language anymore. It is not possible. They can't organize freely, or they can't organize without fear of risk, that they will be surveilled, that their family back home in China will get visits from the Chinese Public Security Bureau. Chinese students on campuses in the U.S. have told me that they're afraid to speak out in class if there's other Chinese students there because they're afraid they'll be reported on, whatever. So restoring the democratic rights of Chinese communities. And I think from this perspective, preserving and restoring, by keeping that front and center, we are pushing back against the transnational repression and against the domestic political interference that the Chinese Communist Party has so far done basically with impunity for 30 years, while not making the victims of that the scapegoats for it.
Hi, thank you for being here. I wanted to ask your opinions on using tariffs to kind of defeat Chinese influence, or I guess you could call it a trade war, as a lot of the journalists like to call it. And I've heard one perspective that our economy is so intermingled with China, and that China is so established in the international markets and the international system that we need to work it out. We need to use our influence, but ultimately we need to find a way to kind of coexist, almost like a 21st century of détente, if you will, And then there's another perspective that, no, China's distinct, China's different. They're of the same vein, essentially, as the Soviet Union, as Nazi Germany, and that they are using their economic might against us, kind of like you said, with rule by law. So the only way forward, if we want to preserve democracy, if we want to preserve our system, is to basically disentangle our economy and use our economic might against China. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Well, the Soviet Union was one thing, but the Cold War was we shaped our half of the Cold War, right? We made our choices, and I think one of the U.S. mistakes during the Cold War was to put pure national security above everything else, and that resulted in a lot of the excesses that were so harmful to so many people around the world. The coups that we were involved in, and this. Sort of almost race to the death with the Soviet Union. And so what I mean is that what we should do, or what kind of threat China poses, is shaped to some extent by our own choices and our own behavior. And so I don't think that at this time, the Chinese government, neither the U.S. nor Beijing, are we at the point where we are kind of at a dagger with each other's throats, and we could slit each other's throats at any moment. We are not there yet. And whether or not we get there, Beijing has agency over that, and so do we. It's not just one or the other. To your question of economic power, I think the number one key, there's maybe 2 or 3 key things to keep in mind. The first one is the importance of collective action. So getting like-minded partners and allies on board, and with the U.S. And with creating guardrails in the economy, more resilient supply chains, friendshoring, sanctions on Chinese companies that are complicit with the genocide in Xinjiang or that have links to China's civil military fusion complex. This kind of thing. Getting as many government and economies on board with that as possible. Not just to win, but to draw some boundaries and say, you can't go any further than this. I think that Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party understand power. They understand the realities of power. And I think that there can be a kind of détente. I think détente is at this point probably what we are trying to aim for.
Bear that out, though. I mean, you look at what happened in the 70s with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, they were picking the battlegrounds. They were growing in strength, essentially. But then the Reagan administration comes. They begin to, like you said, they start coups in different countries. They pick the battlegrounds, and suddenly the Soviet Union can't keep up. Suddenly the Soviet Union doesn't have the momentum.
Right. I think it is good for us to pick the battlegrounds. I hope that we don't make it literally a battle, though. And I think it's really, really important for what we're fighting for, which is democratic values and democratic political values, to stay out in the forefront. That we have no business overturning the governments of other countries ever, no matter how bad they are, because that's not our business and that's not our values. So how we fight is also very important. And I think at this point we are primarily looking at an economic struggle. So collective action, because the U.S. economy is just not big enough to dominate, to change the Chinese government's behavior. And then second is in countries that are not like-minded partners. And as you know, a lot of the Cold War played out in what is a Cold War term, the Third World, right? What does that look like right now? What it should look like. So let me compare Cambodia and Tanzania, and I've been to both places this year. Cambodia is basically a Chinese client state. The U.S. is not involved, and I don't know that we really should be, but because of the nature of the government and its human rights abuses, etc. But Cambodia has no choice. It is basically a vassal state of China. Tanzania, on the other hand, where I was just in July, is not. The U.S. is very active there in providing assistance. So is Germany. So is Denmark. So is China. So is the United Arab Emirates. And that gives Tanzanian officials and other people their choice. And I don't mean this in a theoretical way. I mean literally choice. And I'll give an example. A few years ago, 5 or 6 years ago, there's a port near Dar es Salaam known as Bagamoyo Port. And the Chinese government basically pulled a Sri Lanka on Bagamoyo Point, where they were like, yes, we will develop this and make it a deep sea port so that you can finally compete with like Mombasa and stuff. But you just have to give us a 99-year lease. That's fine, right? And also give up your sovereignty essentially over these other two cities so that only we can develop them. You cannot develop them, Tanzania, only we can develop them. At the time, the terms of that agreement were not made public, but a few years later, Magufuli, who was a very authoritarian style leader under CCM, the ruling party of Tanzania, he died by chance in 2021, he actually came out publicly, and I think it was 2019, made the terms of this agreement public, denounced them, suspended it, and said that this is exploitation from China. And so as a result, the Chinese government or state-owned enterprises are not developing Bagamoyo Port. And so right now the Tanzanian government is actively courting other countries, Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates, to develop that port. But you know, like the United Arab Emirates doesn't we're not directly competing with UAE for like global dominance, you know, so it's just less concerning. So this is an actual very clear example of how when a government has choice, as long as it hasn't crossed certain lines of genocide that force the U.S. to leave, for the U.S. to stay engaged, it literally provides choice.
But if we're thinking of the third world, where a lot of countries don't have a strong democratic tradition, where the hopes to have one are extremely idealistic at best, isn't it better in the long run interest of freedom to have a Pinochet who's friendly to the U.S. instead of a Castro who's working for the other side who's just as oppressive and just as bad?
Well, let me give an example of Iran. Iran has had exactly one almost democratic election in the early 1950s with Mossadegh. And Mossadegh was also pretty nationalist, and he did not like how Britain had, sort of semi-colonial control over the Iranian oil industry. And so he nationalized Iranian oil. I think that was his right. I think it was wrong for Britain to have that kind of control that was wrested from Iran in a moment of weakness in the 19th century. Mossadegh was the closest thing that Iran has ever had to a democratically elected leader, but he was not pro-Britain and he was not pro-US. And so very famously, the CIA worked with Britain to secretly foment a coup and overthrew him and reinstall the Shah, who was very authoritarian, but at least was pro-West. And that made Iranian people so angry that it created over a period of time the Shia Islamic fundamentalist movement that buoyed Khomeini into power in 1979. They occupied the U.S. embassy for more than a year. I forget how many days, 300 some odd days, or 180 days. And now we have Iran. So I think it's incredibly short-sighted to act in that way. And it's also just simply wrong.
Looking at Chile, I mean, you had Salvador Allende.
Okay, so sorry, we are 5 minutes over, so I just want to do one other question because I know we started a few minutes late.
Oh, yeah, and I'll make it quick. First, I wanted to say that your wise advice about preserving our own, make sure we're preserving our own values, reminds me of Candide, tending your garden. So it's time tested values. I'm wondering, we clearly in the past generation or two have made in the West, some major missteps, miscalculations about how to arrange our relationships with China, one of which was allowing the massive retooling of our economy to allow massive offshoring. And we're trying to play catch up on that now. Those kind of decisions are made at levels way higher than my job level. I live in a binary local world. I am wondering, I loved your Zoom story, and I love the fact that your reporting stimulated that. But it makes me wonder, we have a huge national intelligence community. The CIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, etc. They're massive, they're huge, they're active. They are regularly updating Congress, and presumably the way it works is that Congress then proceeds to craft legislation based on the intel they're getting from the communities. Where is that failing that we are not picking up in that mechanism, which would lead me to go about able to tend my own little garden. So thank you.
I almost get your question, but what is it that you're saying that we have had failed at? Is it in detecting this kind of?
In our apparatus, seeming to accurately make assessments and then advise Congress accordingly. For example, didn't they have intelligence that the Chinese government was in essence infiltrating Zoom? And didn't they then say to Congress, look, this is a new Chinese government policy direct way they're going, statecraft. And so we suggest you consider legislation as opposed to you coming out of left field, sua sponte. Why isn't our apparatus working? Why are we seeming to miss things and make missteps?
That is an excellent point. And in the Zoom example, what I laid out here is, I mean, DOJ is almost legislating for us by saying you can or can't do this as a company, and that's a great point. Let me give you some background that's specific to China. So in Obama's second term, so 2012 to 2016. The Department of Justice was its counterintelligence unit and some other units in the U.S. intelligence community were operating, but primarily, let's say, the counterintelligence unit in the FBI was operating under directions to disrupt when they saw Chinese industrial espionage or Chinese political interference, covert Chinese political interference operations in the United States. They were very understaffed, but in any case, they were doing that. To disrupt. But what happened was, from 2012 to 2016, they saw an enormous rise in the scale and scope of across the board, all kinds of covert operations, from industrial espionage to political espionage to covert political influence operations. But they were still only allowed to disrupt. What does that mean? While maybe you can try to stop this, that, or the other, what the body of the IC community knows the Chinese government is doing is still a secret. It was all still a secret. And so the U.S. national narrative about China was la-di-da, engagement, so great, little problem in the South China Sea, but other than that, it's fine. Meanwhile, what was known in IC circles was way up here and getting worse and worse and worse. So by 2015, by 2016, people were really very deeply alarmed and concerned both about what they were seeing and the fact that nobody was talking about it. Literally nobody was talking about it. And that's also true of Congress. Congress was not necessarily getting these brief. I mean, a lot of what Congress does, yes, we have our, intelligence oversight committees and all these committees that can get, briefings and things, but they have to request them, in many cases, or they have to push for it, or they have to care about it, and they can't care about it if it's not being debated publicly. And so there was this total failure in our debate that was based on this idea of disrupting rather than pursuing indictments. This changed under the Trump administration, starting in 2018 and with greater and greater momentum, and that has been carried on by the Biden administration. It was a very conscious effort that was, formulated in, within the National Security Council under Trump. We want more people to know about what is happening. We want people to understand how the CCP operates, what it is doing, and we want to get this out there. So there were big efforts in a lot of ways to make this more public, but one of them was by pursuing indictments. And so with the Zoom case, the only reason I know about everything that happened behind the scenes, the reason you know about it, is because of that policy change. And there have now been so many indictments that we just have a much greater public knowledge. And as a journalist, I can't subpoena people. I can't take their cell phones. I can't, read their emails unless they willingly show them to me. And so I can investigate things, and there's ways that you can get people to talk to you, but I can't do that. I couldn't have gotten, Xin Zhangjin's emails. That's what government power is for when used appropriately. So this is part of the reason that we had this failure. And I would say really only in the past 2 to 3 years now has enough of this stuff become actually public knowledge that we all are much more of a consensus of understanding. This is also, by the way, when the Trump administration started having this pivot on China, it seemed so disingenuous. It seemed just like, the U.S. just pulling another Iraq, because people, and including European allies, didn't believe. They did not believe that it was the kind of threat that it is. Now, because of all these indictments, because of many other things, because European governments and Australia and New Zealand now are making, and Canada are making more and more things public, our narrative has caught up. Does that in part answer your
Yes,
question?
it does. Thank you. Thank you.
I realized I kept you way over. Thank you for spending extra minutes with us.